Tell me when you're ready. So, Lee, I want to go back and talk about your story growing up a little bit. And I know you wrote a lot of it in your book.
Yes, sir.
A good bit of it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So tell me about your life growing up. Well, first of all, tell us where you grew up. And some of this is going to be like I never heard it before, right? Mm-hmm. So, because people that are going to be listening to parts of it. So tell me about your life growing up just a little
Well,
bit.
I grew up in Boothville, and I lived there all the beginning of my life before I left home. I grew up in the middle of the Depression, which, as you know, 1926 was when things were really bad. But it was interesting, and I did mention this in my book, that we were fared out quite well. My dad was a farmer. He was a citrus farmer, but he always had a very large garden, and we had fresh vegetables all the time. He owned a lease, an oyster lease, and so we had free oysters all the time. He loved to fish, and we had a lot of fish, and he loved to hunt. We had a lot of game to eat, so we didn't hardly feel the Depression. And, you know, we're sitting there with having everything we needed and reading about all of these people who are selling apples on the corner and things like this. So, so we were very fortunate.
That's awesome. Tell me about your siblings again. I don't remember how many. Tell me about your family. So your dad was a citrus farmer.
He was a citrus farmer, and he had been an oyster grower before that. And just before he and my mother were married, he bought this little farm, had a shotgun house on it, and a couple of scraggly orange trees. And he built it up. He doubled the size of the house, and then he started planting orange trees, and he had one of the prettiest orchards. And that time, Plaquemine Parish had orchards, orange orchards, from one end to the other, and it was absolutely gorgeous. And of course, the freezes in the early 50s and then the hurricanes in the 60s kind of wiped everything out. So when he retired finally from farming, he didn't have any crops left at all.
Gotcha. I gotcha. So there was another question I was going to answer. Let me just look at my list. I'm sorry. So Lee, did you guys go to church when you were down there? Were y'all in Catholic church?
Did I what?
Did y'all go to church there when y'all went down there?
Yeah, we were Catholic, all dedicated Catholic. My mother never missed church, and we had to go to catechism every Saturday and church on Sunday.
Gotcha. That's awesome. She made sure, huh?
Yeah.
That's great. So how old were you in 1926 when the crash happened? Do you remember?
When in 1926,
yeah.
I was born.
You were born in 1926.
Yes.
Is that when the crash took place?
No, the crash was in
early 20s, right?
It was after that.
29.
Really,
that's
the
right.
crash
That's right.
hit.
You were
Yeah.
3 years old.
29, wasn't it?
Yeah, 29. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. That's right.
So I grew up with until I went into service. You know, the World War II ended this Depression. The Depression didn't cease until World War II, and so I grew up. Most of my life was in the Depression area.
So when you tell me about the day when Pearl Harbor. Tell me about Pearl Harbor Day for you.
Ooh, wow!
You remember?
I was that was in 1973.
No, Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese...
I'm talking 1943.
1943.
Yes. I graduated from high school in 42 and went to work immediately. I was probably working on a drilling rig at that time. I don't recall, but I went to work in driving a boat in the oil field for a while, and then hired out to Rowan Drilling Company as a roughneck. And I was roughnecking when I was 16 years old.
Wow.
And I worked there for them until I went into service. And that was in 1944.
So tell us how you ended up in the service. Were you drafted?
Well, I signed up, before I signed up for the draft, which was at my 18th birthday, I tried to volunteer for the Marines. And in fact, my dad and I went to New Orleans, and I checked at the Marines. They wouldn't take me because I was colorblind. Then we went to the Navy office and tried there, and they said the same thing. They wouldn't take me. So I checked with the Army, and they said, well, if you're 18, you have to when you're 18, you're going to have to sign for the draft anyway. So I did. I said, but if you sign up for the draft, when you do, volunteer for immediate induction, and you can pick the service branch you want to get into. So I did. And 10 days after my 18th birthday, I got my notice that they wanted me. And so I picked the artillery for my branch of service and went to Camp Roberts, California, and trained in artillery.
Wow.
And as I progressed, they started moved me over to communications, and I ended up being a wire man, running wire, and had to learn the electrical business. And it was the same training that the Signal Corps got in service.
That's cool.
And so when I did go to war, I was head of the wire squad and did all the wiring for an infantry division.
That's cool. Question, I'm going to back up just 2 steps if you don't mind. I'm going to ask you one thing, because I mentioned before, sometimes people are not going to have the context of the conversation. So there's 2 things I'm going to ask you. One is just back up, because you touched it a little bit, but I want to talk about it a little more, Lee, if that's okay. And that is specifically, what was life like in the country? I know what it was like for you, and you guys did okay. But if you had to characterize life in the U.S. from your perspective, pre-World War II, right in the Depression time, just before you were entering the war, could you give us a little bit of a snapshot? And if you could start that conversation with, life in the United States was ... Does that make sense?
Life in the United States, and especially for farmers, was pretty bad. Prices of everything went pots. We were selling oranges for 50 cents a bushel, and but in our case we were fine because we had all of the other things. But most farmers were really suffering during during the Depression before World War II, and it was beginning of World War II that started bringing things back, and farmers started doing pretty well because there was such a market then.
So then the next thing I wanted to ask you about is when the United States stepped into World War II, which obviously was when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
So if you could start that part of the conversation with, well, the war began for the U.S. or something like that, or when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, ... Does that make sense, Lee? So what I'm trying to do is get a perspective, your perspective on when America went to war, this is how things changed. Does that make sense?
Yes, everything changed. The economy started improving because there was such a demand for farm products. The factories were wide open, building airplanes, building ships, and I had an aunt that had worked in bookkeeping. It was all she'd ever done, and she became a welder in a shipyard. So the economy was booming not long after the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
So do you remember where you were? You said you might have been on an oil rig. Do you remember where you were when you got the news about Pearl Harbor? Does that ring a bell at all or not really?
I think I was at home, and as I recall, I was working in the oil field. I could go back and check my record, but
that's okay.
I've got my W-2s from back then. So
you do?
I have a couple of them, yeah.
You were kidding me.
Mm-hmm.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So what did you do? You remember what you felt when you heard the news?
I think I was like most of the young men at that time. I was only 16 years old, but we wanted to get into action. We wanted to get in the war and do our part.
Gotcha.
And if you read the history about this period, young men were volunteering all over the country to get into war. In fact, a lot of the young men went to war before we declared war because they went to England and got into and some to Canada and joined their armies.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So Lee, tell me about World War II from your perspective. Just kind of big picture, like how did it affect you personally? And then how did it affect our country? Just any thoughts you have just about the war itself.
Well, it was the last war that we won. That's interesting. If you look back, we haven't won a war since then. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we had any choice but to get into the war. Roosevelt, our president, would have liked to have gotten in a little bit sooner, but there were a lot of people in the country that were trying to keep us isolated. I'm moving, right?
Oh, you're okay. You're fine.
Anyway, the country, I think it was, somebody said, and I'm not sure, that the Japanese woke a sleeping giant. Is that the expression that was used? And we became the supplier of the war, really. We were building airplanes for England and ships for them too, and supplying them. Before we got into the war, we were supplying England for their part in the war. So as the war progressed, the country was just booming everywhere.
So when you went to boot camp, right, you signed up, they said you got 10 days after your 18th birthday, you got your order.
Well, I think I got my notice then. I probably went in about 3 or 4 weeks after my 18th birthday.
So what happened?
What happened?
Where'd you go?
I was glad. I went into New Orleans, and they sent me to Camp Bubrig in northern Louisiana. And from there, I was assigned to my boot camp, which was in Camp Roberts, California. And it was an artillery camp. The whole camp was artillery. And after I started my basic training, after I completed my basic training, they moved me into communications training. And so I think I was there until about the end of November, maybe, or maybe the beginning of November. Again, if I read my book, I think I've got the dates in there.
That's okay. That's fine. That's
But I then they sent us to Fort Hood, Texas, to complete our training in artillery and in communications. And that was about in the latter part. I remember I had a delay en route when I left Camp Roberts to go to Fort Hood. And I came home in the middle of the hunting season, so I went duck hunting with my dad. I remember that well. And then from Camp Hood, we moved to Fort Lawton, Washington, which was a port of embarkation for the Army. Was there until Christmas Eve. And I had a date on Christmas Eve. I don't tell this tonight much, but they locked us in, and I couldn't make my date. So then we shipped. I went to Hawaii first and took some advanced training there, and then loaded up the ship to go into to the South Pacific and into battle.
Right.
Our first stop was in Leyte, where we first encountered the kamikaze planes. They were trying to bomb us in the harbor there. We stopped there to form up the convoy. Then we kept on going in the Pacific until we got to Okinawa. And that's when the kamikazes really hammered us.
Tell us about that.
We got there about 2 days before the landing was scheduled. And we were sitting helpless in the harbor, and these kamikazes, or suicide planes, were coming in and just running into the ships. They were trying to get the carriers mostly. But of course, the troop ships were number one in their priority too. And that was probably the worst part of the war for me, because we were so helpless. We were just sitting in the ship and moving standstill targets, And then on April 1st, Easter Sunday, we landed on the island. And it was the first island that we did not run into any opposition on the landing. The Japanese had decided to back up into the mountains and wait for us there. And they fought a battle.
Wow. So Lee, tell me a little bit about, again, you're sitting in a harbor, or you're in a harbor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you guys are just
It
sitting
really
there.
was a harbor. It's kind of a bay near where we were going to land.
Gotcha. And so the kamikaze pilots would come after you guys there?
Mm-hmm.
Did they ever hit a ship that you were on?
No, never did. We saw some around us. It was ironical. They wouldn't let us get on deck. They kept us in the dining hall, and we'd hear the bombing, and they were bombing as well as just driving their planes into the ships. And we'd hear them, and it was so scary because we couldn't even see what was going on. So a friend of mine, one of my buddies, we got through the guards and got up on deck, and it was something to see. It was terrible.
Tell me what you saw.
You see ships burning everywhere, and the anti-aircraft was just a steady roar. They were firing at them. I have no recollection of how many ships, but there was probably a couple of thousand ships altogether in that invasion, including minesweepers, destroyers, and troop ships, supply ships, and our guns. I was in an 8-inch Howitzer outfit, which was the biggest artillery in the South Pacific, and they came over in an LST. So we landed we didn't go in the first wave, but we landed about noon. And then we had to wait for our LSTs to find a place to unload and get our guns ashore.
That's amazing. That's amazing. You know, real quick.
That was the happiest day of my life, believe it or not, when we landed.
Get off that ship and not
I
go
figured
like
that whatever was on shore I could protect myself from, but I couldn't protect myself on that ship.
Wow. You know, I have a great uncle who was in the Pacific.
Oh, really?
His name is Richard Armand. And he was a gunner's mate on a troop transport ship in the Pacific. So he made, I don't know if he landed in Okinawa, I can't remember, but he was the guy that, I know you probably know that, but he would point out the planes for the aircraft guns. And he saw physically several times where the planes would, you know, crash into the ships.
Yeah, we've seen several. Most of the ones I saw were aircraft carriers. They loved to hit the aircraft carriers. And of course, the aircraft carriers were well defended by destroyers and cruisers around them, and had anti-aircraft of their own. So many of them were shot down before they got to the ships, but they did crash some. And if you read the history about it, there were several aircraft carriers that were put completely out of commission in the first few days of the battle there.
Mm. Yeah, so one of the stories that he told me specifically about the kamikaze planes, one, he was on the aft of the ship, the rear end of the ship, right? Mm-hmm. And the bow of the ship they had troops, everywhere, just trying to fight them and do whatever they needed to do. And he was on the back end, and a kamikaze plane put his prop right in the middle of the bow of that ship.
Really?
And killed everybody on deck and just destroyed it. And he survived that one. He said the second time there was a plane that came by and barely missed where he was and clipped his wing off on its way into the Pacific Ocean or in the bay or wherever they were. And he said that they fished that guy out, and they were constantly trying to do stuff to get killed. Like, in other words, because it was disgraceful to be captured.
That was an amazing thing to me, and even more so after I got home and realized what was what was really happening, that these guys would volunteer to do that. Of course, near the end of the war, they weren't volunteering anymore. I think they were forcing them to fly these planes. But many of them volunteered to just sacrifice their lives. And
that's crazy.
Ironically, one of our best friends right now is a Japanese girl whose father was fighting on the other side.
Wow. Where is she?
He wasn't on Okinawa. He was on some of the other islands. But
Who is that?
Her name is Sashiko. She's a seamstress, and she does all Nana's costumes, and got to be real friendly.
It's not going to be on tape. Most of this is going to get edited, so you don't have to worry about anything now. Anything I say is going to get edited out. That's why sometimes if I don't respond to you, I don't want my voice on this. Mm-hmm. I just want your voice on it. Does that make sense? I'm trying to be quiet. How are we doing? Good. Doing good?
Well,
so,
I'm sorry. I was going to say, if you had it off, one of our trips to Canada, I had told Sachiko that we went through, what's the place in Michigan, baby, where her...
Detroit?
No, in Michigan that we went through.
Oh, I don't remember the name of the little town. We dropped her off there.
Her cousin lived there, and she was married to a guy from the U.S., and we dropped her off at a rest area, and then we went off to Lee's daughters and our son-in-laws, and then on the way back we picked her up, Flint, Michigan. Mm-hmm. And when we stopped back, they came in the motorhome, and we were talking, and his name was Clem, and her name's Yuriko. He says, can you believe this? He says, that you wouldn't think this would ever happen. He said here, because Yuriko was in war with Japan, and Clem was with the U.S. He said, here this woman was trying to kill me, and I end up marrying her.
That's funny.
Go ahead.
That's awesome. So Lee, a couple things. So y'all obviously make the landing in Okinawa, right?
We did what? I'm
You
sorry.
made the landing in Okinawa.
Yes.
And you're waiting for the LSTs to get in a position where they can actually unload the.
Actually, the beach was so crowded at first that it was the next day. It was the 2nd of April when they landed, and we got our guns ashore. And 8-inch howitzer is a monster gun, and we had tracked vehicles to tow them. And so we towed them into position, and I was NCO in charge of the wire squad then. And the way this worked is, as soon as we got set up and started firing our guns, we had radio contact. We used radios. And so I was part of the communications group, and it was our sergeant was a radio man. And they would use radios to direct the fire and everything until we could get wires run. Well, we would run wires up to the OP, which is right at the front lines, and then connect to our guns and to I actually had a switchboard in my pup tent, and my switchboard operator and I slept together, and he operated the switchboard in our pup tent. It was a little small switchboard, and so we had to connect everything up, and then we changed over to wire for everything, because the radios, they had one problem with radios: the Japanese could hear what was going on, and they did. And they could not only hear it, but they could track our position. And one of the main things that we did with our big guns was to fire on their artillery. And of course it worked both ways. They were firing on us at the same time. So most of our firing was done at night because we could spot their gun locations from their flashes. And so it was a little bit spooky at night. My switchboard operator and I was a young kid he was from Brooklyn. His name was Bussi, B-U-S-S-I, I think. And we had to dig foxholes, of course, because as soon as the artillery started coming in, we had to be in a foxhole. So he and I scrounged up a couple of stretchers that were left on the battlefield, and we dug our double foxhole for both of us. Then we put our stretchers across the top of it and slept there. So if artillery started coming in, we'd just roll out of the stretchers into the foxhole. And near the end of the battle, the water was about 8 inches deep in the foxhole. So you'd go from bed into water. It wasn't nice.
That is funny. That is such a funny story. That is so funny. So Lee, where did you guys set up your big guns?
Where? We'd find a valley or something behind the lines, and our outfit was howitzers. Our guns were howitzers, which means they shoot in they're not horizontal shooting. They lob shells in. So we could shoot over the mountains, and the Japanese had dug into the caves into the mountains, and their entrances were all in the back side of the mountain from us, so we could lob shells back into there. And of course their guns were mounted behind the line just like ours were, and we could fire on their guns.
What was your range?
Pardon?
What was your range?
Range? Our guns could shoot 10 miles.
10 miles?
Mm-hmm. A 200-pound projectile, 10 miles. Now, we were never that far back, but...
what were they shooting at you guys? 88s?
Pardon?
What were they shooting at you guys? What were their guns?
I think the largest gun they had might have been 75s. I'm not sure. They didn't have any real heavy artillery. But they built these caves through the mountains. And they'd go completely through a mountain. And they'd mount their guns in a cave facing us. And they'd fire a while, and then they'd back the guns up out of the cave. They'd usually had them on tracks. And so they could fire at us, and then when we started firing back, they'd back them into the cave. So our observers would see the flashes, we'd fire on it and think we got them, and a few minutes later they were firing again. So
wow.
They had and this is something brand new for the Japanese to fight from the mountains like that. I think they did it on Iwa a little bit. They had their caves there, but Okinawa, they had it riddled with caves. They could put their whole army in caves. They had 100,000 men in their army there, and they could house them all in caves. Their artillery cave, and we went into it after the war. I mean, their headquarters cave was something to see. It was beautiful.
Tell us about it.
Well, it was, they had built these caves and then shored them up. They had, the general's quarters were, was pretty nice, and they had female secretaries all over the place, and we captured a bunch of the girls because most of them were Okinawans. They forced a lot of the Okinawans to fight with them, and they forced a lot of the women to do their paperwork and help, and even some of the nursing. They had some nurses from Japan, but most of them were from Okinawa.
So did you go into those spaces then?
After the war, yes, we did. As soon as the campaign ended, and what had happened, and I comment this in my book too, the Japanese were really good at infiltrating because they looked just like the Okinawans. And so they could dress in civilian clothes and just walk in behind our lines. So we left, I don't remember the exact number, but when the campaign ended, they lined up all of the soldiers and Marines on the island and just walked from one end of the island to the other and found these Japanese that were still in caves and still hiding somewhere. And I think there was something like 10,000 of them still hidden that we passed by.
Wow.
Some of them, I read somewhere that they found caves 10 years after the war that they'd stayed in,
And they just were still hiding.
They stayed there.
That's amazing, huh? That's amazing.
I think they did that on a couple of the islands.
I had heard those stories.
They passed them by, yeah.
That. Lee, so talk to me just a little bit more in general about, so you're 89, and there's a lot of people that you were peers with that fought in World War II. Just in general, what for personally, how did World War II affect you, and how do you think it affected some? Because you lost some of your friends, right? I mean, I would imagine some. So can you talk about a little bit about that?
Well, fortunately, I was being in the artillery, even though we would go up to the front lines when we were running our lines. We were not as endangered as the guys in the infantry who were up on the front lines fighting. But I had some friends that were there, and lost a few of them. And one of the boys that I had gone to school with, and I found him in Okinawa after the war, after the campaign was over. And he told me a little bit about what the infantry went through, and it was, we could see it, but we weren't participating in the frontline battle. But it was horrible. It really was. The Japanese fought to the end. There was 100,000 there, and I think there was only about 10,000 that surrendered. The rest of them we killed. So, and the ones that, a lot of them committed suicide right at the end, rather than the general committed suicide. Ironically, both generals were killed on the island. Our general was just a few days before the campaign ended, he was hit by artillery.
Your general was?
Yeah.
Who was that?
General Buckner.
Okay.
And the Japanese general committed suicide.
Wow.
Just right at the end of the island. And a lot of the Japanese soldiers jumped off of the cliff at the end of the island and committed suicide.
Wow. That's so sad. That's just sad.
One of the generals who was kind of the administrator for the army, they allowed to escape. He didn't commit suicide. All the other generals all committed suicide. But they wanted him to go back to Japan to report on how the battle went, because the next step was going to be our invasion of Japan's main islands. And he wrote a book that was really interesting. He dressed in civilian clothes and walked right through the lines, and right at the end of the battle, and ended up in a compound where the Okinawans were. He passed as an Okinawan. But one of the Okinawan men there recognized him and spilled the beans, so we captured him. And he was told to find a boat somewhere and try to get back to the main line to report on how the battle went to them.
Wow.
So they could prepare for us on the main islands.
It's amazing. What an amazing story.
And this is really, I read his book, it was a good story.
Lee, how did the war affect you personally? How did it affect you?
I guess I was pretty happy that I got through it alive, that's for sure. But you know, when you're 18 years old and you think the other guy might get killed, but you're not going to get it. So that's pretty well the way it was during the war. After the war, I came home, got married, and went to work. That was it. And first I went back to work for my company that I'd worked for before, Ruin Drilling Company. And worked with them for a while. Then I changed to Gulf Oil Company and worked with them until late 60s, I think.
Did you feel like you had carried any, and maybe this is not the case for you because you weren't infantry, but did you feel like that you carried any scars from that war, or not necessarily? It wasn't necessarily a traumatic.
I didn't want to talk about it very much. And in fact, I think when I wrote the book was probably Nina learned a lot more from the book than anything I ever told her. And at first, I never talked about it at all. It was something that was kind of taboo for me.
Why is that?
I guess if you call that a scar, it was a scar.
So do you feel like that was the case for a lot of the guys that fought with you?
Probably so, yes. Because I remember this same kid that I had met over there that was in infantry. I saw him after the war at home, and he didn't mention the war at all. We didn't talk about war. Neither one of us wanted to talk about it. And, you know, I guess the biggest impact was seeing all of the dead bodies, not only the Japanese, but all our own boys. There was so many around that we'd stumble on them. I'd be out at night trying to run wire and stumbling over dead bodies. That's not very nice.
Yeah, very traumatic. Yeah, it has an impact on you.
Yeah. And we got to the point where there was so many dead Japanese around it. We had a bulldozer in our unit, and we had to bulldoze a big hole and bury a lot of them in a bulldozer, and pick out the U.S. casualties and keep them separate and bury the Japanese.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's basically
because they were decaying and the flies were bad, and actually they had to start spraying DDT during about the middle of the campaign. There was so many flies on the dead bodies.
Wow. So if you were to talk about your generation, it's also been referred to as the greatest generation that's ever lived.
The what? I'm sorry.
So if you were to talk about your generation, right? And I think it was Tom Brokaw talked about, referred to you guys as the greatest generation. Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard that? I
think so. I felt like we lived in the ideal time, and especially after the war, I think it was boom-bill in the United States, and everything was upbeat. Our politicians were not the same kind of politicians we have these days, and we weren't being quite so burdened with taxes. So it was a good generation. Yeah, I enjoyed living that life. I wouldn't want to be growing up in this day and age as compared to that.
Yeah, I understand.
As kids, we could play on the street. We could play anywhere. It's not the case anymore.
Right. So what do you think, what would be, do you feel like, are you grateful that you had a chance to fight in World War II? And if so, why?
I think it was a learning experience, and I think it helped me, yes. And Nina might say I learned how to iron my own clothes, so that was something.
That was positive.
Positive.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What else would you take away from that experience? It was positive for you.
Pardon?
What else would you take away from the whole experience of being in war that was a positive outcome?
I think just thinking for yourself and being, I think as a kid growing up until I was 18 years old, I was probably pretty shy. In fact, I was very shy. I think I had my first girlfriend when I was 18. And I think I got out of a lot of that in the service and learned a lot about how other people feel. I think I mentioned in my book that during basic training we had a sergeant, a training sergeant who was mean as the devil. But after a while, we learned that the reason he was mean, he was trying to teach us how to fight a war. And the guy that we hated at the beginning, we probably loved at the end. So it changed your perspective a little bit.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So you talked a little bit about what life was like when you came back from the war. But now here you are, and you've had a wonderful life. You're not done yet, obviously.
I hope not.
But you've got, there's a lot of men, and I'm going to circle back around and touch a couple of other things if that's all right before we finish up. But there's a lot of people that are serving in the military right now. And you mentioned earlier in our conversation, but if you could talk about that again, what is your perspective on people that serve in the military right now?
I think it's wonderful that they do this. I think most of our Army now is volunteer Army, and I know I had a grandson who joined the service just so that he could get an education, which he did. And so I think it's great that they volunteer to fight these wars. And again, as I said, when you're 18 or 20 years old, you don't think anything can happen to you. It just happens to the other guy. So, but it takes a certain amount of bravery to fight a war.
Absolutely. So again, if you wanted to tell the veterans, you mentioned, what do you tell veterans when you talk to them? And if you could say, when I see somebody, not a veteran, but when I see somebody in the military, so if you could say that, Lee, when I see someone that serves in the military, what do you tell them? Do you ever tell them anything?
I tell them thank you, yes, thank you for serving our country.
Yeah.
And I think I learned a little bit of that from my wife. She says that every time she sees anyone. Of course, she gets into a conversation with them. And
That's good. That's really good. Let me take a little break, okay? I'm going to review my notes for a second. I'm going to talk to these guys about... Rephrase that. Yeah. So if you could, just do me a big favor. I hate to do this to you because I'm trying not to coach you too much. But if you could tell them, if you could say that when I see somebody that's serving in the military, I tell them thank you. Do you understand?
Yeah.
Could you say that for me? Do you mind?
When I see somebody that's in the service or has served in the service, I tell them thank you for serving our country.
And why is that, Lee?
Because I can appreciate what they're going through and what they've gone through.
So if you have a message for, and I'm going to come back to a couple things. We're not done. I'm going to come back to if you could say one message, all right? So you've got, what's going to happen is you're going to have 5,000 people on a weekend, maybe more, maybe 6,000. And you could say a message to veterans that are sitting in church and to people that are active duty military. What would be your message to them, Lee?
For the people who are not in the military or have not been in the military, I would say appreciate your boys that are serving in the country. And I don't think we have enough of that appreciation in this country now, and I guess it goes back to the Vietnam War and the Korean War, when soldiers were not treated very well when they came back from the war. It wasn't their fault. They were told to go to war, and they obeyed orders. But yet, that generation didn't appreciate the Army. I think that has changed, and now we are more appreciative of the boys that are serving in our country.
So that's the message to the people that are not in the military. What would you say to the ones that are?
Appreciate these guys, believe me.
So you tell them, I want you to say, guys, thank you for serving. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
You want to tell those guys, hey, and you want to even look at the camera or no? Whatever. All right, let me do this. Let me take a little break because I want to review my notes and see if I'm missing anything.
After the battle on Okinawa, we were on the island of Okinawa. We set up perimeter tents and we were pretty comfortable. But we were preparing to land on the main island. Our outfit was going in. And
Stop for
I
one
have
second.
heard a lot of criticism.
Stop for 1 second if you don't mind. No, we're gonna. That's right. He started to tell me something. I wanted to capture it. So if you don't mind, just you want to come back in, or you getting something else? Okay. I'm sorry.
I didn't realize. I thought y'all were still
We were taking a break, but then he started telling me a really good story.
Anyway, to start over,
No, it's okay.
after the campaign, we were preparing to go into the main island, and our guns were all, we used a grease they call cosmoline to grease them up before they go to sea because of the salt water. But we were all prepared to go, and I've heard a lot of criticism, especially in recent years, about the atomic bomb. But when Truman decided to drop the atomic bomb, it saved about about 1 million casualties that we'd have had in landing on the main island. The Japanese were preparing everyone. They were arming women and children and to fight back if we landed on the main island. And there's a good chance I wouldn't be sitting here today if the atomic bomb hadn't been dropped. I think it was a good decision by Truman, even though he's been criticized for it in the press, especially the liberal press, in recent years.
Yeah.
It just saved a lot of lives, and not only our lives. They expected to lose 1 million people in the landing. Probably several million Japanese lives would have been, and so the atomic bomb didn't kill that many at all. Believe me.
Yes.
It saved Japanese lives as well as our own.
Yeah, Lee, I completely agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
I've read on that. I know the history of it. It's really easy to play armchair quarterback.
Yeah.
Here we are, 60 years later, or 70 years later now, and it's just the reality was there was no other decision. It had to be made, and we would have lost. They estimated, I know, 1 million lives on the U.S. Or Allied side, and then multiple millions of Japanese. So it was an unfortunate event. In fact, I had 2 uncles that were in the Navy in the Pacific theater during World War II. One is fine talking about it, and he's still living today. The other one has since passed away. He could never utter a word about it, and the most we ever got out of him was a little bit about his experience when he landed on, I want to say it was Nagasaki, not long after the bomb dropped, and so he was there right after it happened.
Yeah.
And I think he was so traumatized by his experience there that he just could not talk about anything else.
Yeah.
And it was very disturbing for him. And so, but it was an unfortunate event, but it had to happen. It had to happen. So.
And you say he was in the Navy. Interestingly, in Okinawa, there were 50,000 American casualties in Okinawa. That's dead. I think about 2/3 of those were killed. I guess I just lost my train of thought there, but of these 50,000, 25,000 of them was Navy. There was as many Navy people killed on Okinawa as there was soldiers on the battlefield.
Was it because of the bombings?
The bombing, the kamikazes primarily. They came in waves, at 100 at a time, and that was after we were on the island. We considered ourselves safe on the island fighting where we could protect ourselves. But the Navy guys, they were at the mercy of these people.
Wow.
After the campaign started, they set up perimeters with destroyers and to warn them when the kamikazes were coming in, and these destroyers were, in most cases, just wiped out.
So the kamikazes would go after the destroyers.
Well, they'd have to go by them so they'd stop and pick them up.
Right.
And then right at the end, the Japanese Navy was pretty well wiped out, but they had the largest battleship in the world. And right now, it's on the tip of my tongue. I can't remember the name of it, but they sent it to Okinawa as a suicide trip. They were going to come into Okinawa and try to sink as many ships as they could before they had only enough fuel to go one way. So the whole ship was a suicide ship.
Wow.
And that's probably about 10,000 people on it. Maybe not that many, but it was a big ship. The biggest in the world, the Yokohama, the biggest ship in the world.
Wow, it's amazing. That's amazing. You want to keep going?
That's okay.
You okay? You want to keep going? Is it okay?
Yeah.
All right. Couple things. So I wanted to circle back around. I've still never had you say Pearl Harbor. So if I could get you to say, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, I don't care what you say after that. If you can say something after that, but talk about that one more time. And I apologize for making you do that, but I need to get you to say when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Go ahead.
When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, we were in awe because we had no idea that this little old country was from a small island would try to attack the United States. And they caught us completely unprepared because we had cut our Navy down before the war. We had very few Navy ships. They destroyed most of our battleships, and fortunately our carriers had left the island and some of the carriers were saved. But we were completely unprepared. It was, the whole country was in awe that they would do this. And I think that President Roosevelt got a lot of criticism because they thought that he knew about this bombing before. There was a lot of talk about that the Japanese would attack this.
What do you think?
No, I don't think so.
No, I'd be shocked.
But that was
that would not make any sense.
part of the thinking then that he knew in advance.
That's crazy. That's crazy. So I want to take a few minutes and talk about your faith during that time. Now, I know that you came to faith in Jesus Christ in a different way at some point, obviously, and I don't know, when did y'all come to church at the King? Did you come?
I can tell you, Mary was probably 3 years old, and at the time we weren't going any place, you know.
Where did you
We
go?
weren't heathens, but
No, I understand.
but we weren't happy in the Catholic Church, and so we, you know, we.
I was more of a diehard than she was in the Catholic Church. I grew up as an altar boy and
Me too.
belonged to the what do they call the organization? I was a boxer then. And
So long ago he forgot, which is good.
what was it?
No, I don't know. But,
Anyways, the Catholic organization we participated in sports, and I was a boxer and altar boy at the same time. And when I guess we were living at the farm over here, we were still going to Catholic church and regularly. At the big seminary there in
Yeah, the Abbey.
Yeah, the Abbey.
Yeah.
And Nina had friends that almost started a church up, huh? Is that
well,
the
no, they were going.
It was actually the building right down the street here, yeah.
It was Word of Life.
And
Okay.
she started attending, and so she came home and told me she was leaving the Catholic Church, and kind of upset me because we were pretty dedicated. We spent a lot of money supporting the Catholic Church. When we lived on the West Bank in New Orleans, we were very supportive of the church there. Nicole our daughter attended the Catholic school there. We would help at the fairs and do things like this. We helped collect money to build the school, and built the Catholic school. And then when we moved to North Shore, we followed through there. So I was a little bit dead set against changing, but once she made me see the light, and thanks to Nina, I guess I really started going to the
First Baptist, you started.
I didn't go to any of the other churches before, right?
No.
No, you know, Church of the King.
And I think he felt comfortable because, you know, I mean, it wasn't that far off from the Catholic
course.
Church. And I'm going to say this since this is not going to be, and
No.
we're all, you know, Christians. But I had come back from Word of Life, and I remember he was in traction at home. He had hurt his back.
Oh no.
And he was kind of down, and, you know, Lee and I have always been very close, and he didn't want to say anything. And, you know, I said, tell me. You know, let me tell him. He said he couldn't feel worse with me going to that church than if I would have come home and told him I had cancer.
Oh.
Mm. Yeah, I was pretty dead set against it.
I understand.
Whoa. And then we met this guy who had Jim Anderson. He had a men's Bible study, but he said he would come on a Tuesday night and give Bible study to Lee and I. Well, he told me, his wife told me that Jim said he's never met a man so closed into himself as Lee. So just like a woman, I started planning. Well, you know, if I get in Playmakers Club, in the play, every Tuesday night they have practice. That way, Lee, it will be one-on-one, and he will open up without my being there. Well, you don't try to plan God's work. He plans it himself. I joined the Playmaker Theater. He quit the Bible study. Like, oh, gee. But we started, I don't even know how, we started going to First Baptist, and little Maverick was 3 years old, and it was Christmas time. He said, Babe and Bull Pie, can y'all come to my Church of the King for Christmas? So we said, okay. So we went to the Christmas program with him, and of course, I fell in love.
That was a little church on 59.
Yes,
Yeah.
on
Hold about 50 people.
yes.
And so I told Lee, I said, I knew he was uncomfortable. I said, listen, a lot of couples will go to the and it's been Church of the
That's
King
wonderful.
since
Well, I always felt I was a Christian my whole life, but it was a different world.
So Lee, let's talk about that for a second. So you're on a ship, right? Your port of debarkation was out of Hawaii. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So you get on that ship, and the next stop is going to be in enemy territory.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about how you felt on that ship? Tell me what you said. So, if you don't mind, start the conversation with, I was on the ship
Mm-hmm.
after we left Japan, and I was kind of feeling. I know it's hard for you to express feelings, but I wanted you to talk about that. And if you can, was there any discussions with God about this?
Off the record, you wouldn't believe what I felt.
Really?
And what most of the young kids felt. You know, we were kids. We couldn't wait to get there. We wanted to fight. On a ship to Okinawa, we were anxious to get there. We didn't know where we were going, by the way, until about 3 days before we got to the island. We knew we were in the South Pacific and we were going to some island, but we had never heard of Okinawa. And, most of us were anxious to get into battle. We wanted to do our part, and I felt that way all the way. That, let's get there and get rid of these guys and then end this war.
So where did you ever talk to God in the midst of this whole journey, from the time you enlisted, I guess, technically, right? Until you're there finally you get your feet on solid ground in Okinawa after the kamikazes are coming down. Somewhere in between those 2 points, did you ever stop and talk to Jesus?
I think that being a Catholic, I probably thank God, and probably did not say, use Jesus' name in my prayers at that time, because we were, in the Catholic Church you have your routine prayers, and I always said my Our Father before I went to sleep at night, and thank God that I was still alive. And Jesus, I guess, really didn't get into my life until I got away from the Catholic Church.
Gotcha. Was that at First Baptist then, or was that at Church of the King, or where do you feel like that changed?
I think it was before when I started going to Bible studies.
That's awesome, Neil. Mm-hmm. That's so good. That's so good. So, what's that? By all means, yes.
So you were 16 years old. You'd finished high school, and you were working as a roughneck.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me, where were you working? What did a roughneck do?
What do roughnecks do? Yeah. We wrestle a pipe actually the drilling rig is drilling a hole down in the ground, and so you have a lot of pipe involved. And roughnecks make connections to extend the bit. So you have the drill pipe is in 30-foot lengths, and the driller would drill down 30 feet, and then we'd have to put another joint of pipe onto it, and the roughnecks did that. And then when they got down to a certain depth, like a drill bit of any kind of a drill bit, they wore out after a while. So then we'd have to pull all of the pipe out of the hole, put a new bit on the end, and they call this making a trip. So if you happen to be on shift during that period, and if you're digging down as deep as 5,000 feet, say, at 30-foot lengths of pipe, actually they call it a stand of pipe, which would be two 30-foot lengths. And the stand of pipe stands up in a big drilling rig. And so they pull up a stand of pipe, disconnect it, and stand it up in the corner of the rig. That was what we call a trip. And then they go just the opposite, going back into the hole. You put a new bit on and lower the stands of pipe into the hole, and after each stand you tie in another one and drop it down into the hole until you get back to where you're drilling.
If my math is correct, that's 100 pieces, 100 stands of pipe.
Well, figured out at 3,000 feet, at 60 feet, how many would that be?
3,000, yeah, I thought you said 5.
Well, you'd go,
Yeah.
yeah, we went as low as 8,000.
Yeah. It'd be 40 to anywhere from 60 to 100 somewhere. Well, did you have another question?
So, working as a 16-year-old doing this, like, were you working, 5, 6 days a week, 7 days a week? What were your shifts like?
Originally, we were working 12-hour days. Actually, we were working 8-hour days with 3 shifts when I first started, 7 days a week. The drilling rig was always 7 days a week. And when the boys started going into service after the war started, we had to go on 12-hour shifts. So we worked 7 days a week, 12 hours at a shift.
And then when would you take off? Like you never stop?
That never stopped. Now, we would work swing shifts. So there was a break when we went from a day shift to the midnight shift. We had about 24 hours off, so that was our only time off.
So nowadays it's like 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off.
Yes, most of the drilling works that way now, yeah.
But then it didn't work that way.
No, it was 12 hours, 7 days a week. And it would work. Roughnecking as I progressed on the rig, and this was probably happened after the war. You need to read my book.
Yeah.
I was working derricks a while, and the derrick man goes up in that derrick and help. When you're racking the pipe, you had to grab those big stands of pipe and push them into a rack. It's hard work, very hard work.
Yeah.
And you're hanging out in thin air on a belt when you do this. So it's a little spooky.
That's spooky.
Yeah.
That's good, Lee. Very good. What else, Adam? What else?
I was trying to get when you're 16 and you're working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, and you didn't have any time off, was there anything that you did when you came home, and whether you kind of like chores, or did you go out fish, or did you ever go see a movie or anything like that, or is it just?
Yeah, we grew up in, it was a very small town. Boothville was very small. We had one movie town in Buras, and I did start dating then. I was dating a little girl from down the street, and we'd catch a bus, a city bus. So it wasn't a city bus, it was a country bus, I guess. And we'd go to the movies on sometimes in the evening when I was working even a graveyard shift or a day shift, we'd go to movies. Didn't have a car then. I didn't drive until I was 16, and then it was driving an old orange truck to the market is all I did.
So y'all would go see a movie in Buras? Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm,
That was
yeah.
something you did that was fun?
Buras is a little town about, you've been there, 7 miles away from Boothville.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's easy when you're driving. It's not, or when you're riding a bus, it's not so bad. If you have to walk, it's a long.
Luckily, we had the bus ran from New Orleans to Venice, and but they had the schedule set so that they'd have a bus leaving Venice at about 6 o'clock and going to New Orleans, so we could catch that bus. And then from New Orleans, they had one coming down to Venice, and it passed just about the right time to catch the movies. And there was a movie in Plaquemine Parish, one in Port Sulphur, one in Belchase, one in Buras, and they timed it where they could catch those places. Because actually, when I grew up, we didn't have any roads. We didn't have any cars. So, when I started my first grade, I had to walk about 1.5 miles to school. And actually, my mother was boarding a school teacher then, so it was in a book, right?
Yeah, I remember that.
And we'd walk together with the school teacher, a bunch of us, and about this, in my second grade. Actually, I skipped the first grade and went into second because a teacher boarding at the house had helped me before I started school. And about the second year, though, that I started school, there was at that time a colored guy down the street that owned an old car, and the family's contracted with him to take us to school.
You have that in the book too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. So there was something else about that you prompted, but most of your travel, a lot of your travel was done on the water. Am I right?
On the what?
On the water, right? I mean, you would get from little town to
Oh,
town on the water.
yeah. My dad grew up in a town called Oysterville, and that's where he was born, and he grew up there. It was near the mouth of the river, near Port Eads, if you've heard of Port Eads. And the only access was by water. And when we lived in Boothville, I was probably, up until I was 10 or 12 years old, we had no decent roads. It was all just dirt roads. If it rained, there was no traffic at all on the roads. It's impossible to get to New Orleans. But they were running some what they call packet boats from New Orleans down to the mouth of the river. They'd go down to Burwood and Port Eads and stop it all the way along the way. And if my parents had to go to New Orleans, they'd catch the packet boat. And you had regular stops along the way, and they'd go wait for them and catch the boat.
So cool. Good.
What was New Orleans like the first? Do you remember the first time that you went to New Orleans, or even when you went to the Marine Station? What was New Orleans like then to you?
I had an uncle who had a house on Royal Street. They lived on Royal Street, and down not near Canal Street, but way down Royal Street, which I wouldn't even go in with a escort right now. And we played in the streets. It was just wonderful. We'd go to New Orleans for Mardi Gras when I was probably 5 or 6 or 7 years old. And there was no crime in New Orleans at all. It was wonderful. We had no problem we played kickball out in the streets in Royal Street, in the middle of Royal Street.
Was that a fun place?
Very little traffic.
Was New Orleans a fun place to go for you?
Was it what?
Was it a fun place to go?
Oh, yes, it was. Mm-hmm.
What did you enjoy besides playing?
The first time I got drunk was in my senior year in high school, and a bunch of us went to New Orleans. That's my first experience with liquor.
Put that one up there. Where were you? Where did you guys go?
Pardon?
Where did y'all go? Just to a bar?
Well, this uncle lived in town, and we stayed at their house. About 4 of us from high school, and I was a senior then, and 15 years old. I graduated on my 16th birthday, so we stayed there. But we decided to go do the French Quarter that night, the 4 of us, and we forgot it. We didn't know how alcohol would bother us.
That is funny.
But we made it back safely, and
that's great. Thank God for that.
yeah.
Ride the packet. No, I'm just gonna say we weren't riding packet boats by then. It was probably bust. It's good. What else, Adam? What else are we missing?
Keep going.
That's some good questions.
Yeah, some really good. He's very good at this too.
Really?
But I've got to tell you, we're married 40 years. I've never once seen this man drunk.
Thank God. That's
Never.
good.
Yes, thank God.
That's good. Well, Adam, I'm going to just look over my questions one more time. Lee, is there anything else that you want to say? I mean, you said, earlier you pointed out that there was part of the story we kind of missed.
I think one of the funny things I told in the book was that
Well, hold on, let me wait till Nina's done. Hang on.
Yeah, let me put Sophie where she won't be barking or you won't hear her. I don't know what she's barking. Come here, girl. Sophie. Oh, she can't hear me.
So in the morning when you're staying here, you get up and you get some coffee and go sit out on the back porch. What's your kind of routine in the morning?
What's your routine in the morning? What do you do in the morning?
I love to look out at the flowers that I grow and the birds in my bird feeders, and it's wonderful. I love the country.
Awesome.
I grew up in the country. When Nina and I married about 5 years, we moved to the country. We were living on the West Bank in New Orleans and moved to, bought the farm and that was kind of a unique story. We bought a motor home about 3 years or 4 years after we were married. And we traveled all over this country. We have actually visited every state in the continental United States in a motorhome. 97, sometimes we just passed through them, but
Yeah.
we did visit them. We made trips up the West Coast, up the East Coast, and we had a daughter living in Canada for a while, and we made many trips to Canada. Have good friends in Canada, still good friends.
That's awesome.
We enjoyed that.
So you were
But
getting
I
ready,
always loved the outdoors.
you were getting ready to tell us a story, a funny story, you said?
Yeah, after the war was over, we after the bomb was dropped and the war actually ended, we were still in Okinawa, and a couple of stories about that. We formed a baseball league, called it the South Seas Baseball League, softball rather, not baseball, softball. And I was a pitcher. I pitched softball before I went into service, and then at school, and so I was a pitcher for our team. And I told this story in the book. I was pitching against a big Marine team one night, and this Marine slammed the ball right back into me, and I extended my arm out when I pitched softball, because at that time it was hard pitch underhand, like the girls do now, but the men don't do anymore. And this guy slammed his ball back, and it hit the end of his finger and drove it back to my knuckle. And I said that was the only injury I suffered in war. But I went back. They took me to the emergency room, and the Army doctor, and he looked at that thing and said, "Boy, that must hurt." And he fiddled around with it, and all at once he jerked it back into place. I said, "It didn't hurt before, but it sure hurt then."
That is funny. What a great story. It's a really cool story.
But then after the war, they made our outfit into MP battalion, the whole battalion. We called provisional MPs. And our first duty as MPs was to go to some of the islands and bring the Japanese soldiers back to the mainland. And our battery, which was about 150 men, went to this little island of Jeju, which was just north of Okinawa. And it was 52,000 Japs on that island. And their plan was that after we landed on the mainland, they were going to be behind us. And several of the islands in that particular area were ready to go in behind us, and that was going to be their support group, when we landed on the mainland. But our job was to take them back to Japan. And when you mentioned being Yokohama, was it after the war, or one of them? We carried 1,000 Jap soldiers on an LST and brought them to Sasebo, Japan, which is one of the ports, and unloaded them there. But the amazing thing to me was that these guys on this ship, a lot of them spoke English, by the way. I'd go in and talk to them. There was only 7 of us guarding this shipload of 1,000 Japanese soldiers. And I was a sergeant then, and so I'd go down and mingle with the Japs on this ship. And they were no different than we were. They were forced to fight. They didn't want to fight. They wanted to get home to their families, is all they were interested in. And before we were loading them on a ship, before we got on the ship, we were pretty scary, about 7 guys guarding a LST loaded with Jap soldiers. But they were just as docile as could be and very friendly.
That's great.
And
Wow, that's amazing.
just like we wanted to get home to our families, they wanted to get home to theirs.
It's amazing.
And the general population of Japan didn't want to fight. It was the army
Sure.
people that,
Militarists.
Military,
Military.
in fact, they didn't want to end war. Even after the bomb, they didn't want to end the war. They tried their best to keep the emperor from
I remember that.
surrendering. Yeah,
Yes, I
that's
remember
a
that.
part of history.
Yeah, those guys were just crazy. They were
Yeah.
radicalists. It's really crazy. So it's sad.
Anyway, we did that for a while, and then I was sent to Korea our outfit took over the police work in a little town called Busan. That's in southern Korea. And I was there. I'd served first on a ride squad where we would, this was Korea at that time, probably had thousands of soldiers and sailors and Marines gone in and out of it, and so the town, Tucson was a big port, and so the town was pretty rowdy. And so we had a ride squad that would go out and break up fights in the bars and things like this. And then they transferred me to the stockade, and I worked in the stockade until I left Korea.
So you're a prison guard, basically.
Pardon?
You were like a prison guard then.
Prison. Well, I wasn't a guard. I went there as I guess the bookkeeper for the stockade.
Wow.
And we had a stockade sergeant who was in charge of it. He was over me. And he ended up shooting himself accidentally in the hand. He shot, cleaning his gun, and shot his hand right through the palm of his hand. And so I took over as sergeant of the stockade.
Lee, I have a couple of questions I thought about. One is, do you remember VE Day?
Yes. We were in Okinawa in the middle of the battle.
What happened?
Everybody was pretty happy over it, but our feeling was, hey, the war's over for them and not for us.
Do you remember VJ Day?
Oh, sure.
Tell me about
Then we got loaded, believe me. We had a ball. I've got a picture, in fact, it's in the book, of us celebrating the end of the war.
Can you tell me, I remember VJ Day, and then tell me a little bit about it real quick.
Well, we were, after the campaign in Okinawa, we realized how terrible it would be landing on the main island. And so we weren't as brave as we were before we made the first landing. We were a little worried about it. We were hearing all of the rumors about how they were going to defend themselves. So we were very happy that when the bomb dropped and when the Japanese finally decided to surrender. And had a big celebration on the island, guns firing everywhere, and most of us in my outfit were just elated,
That's wonderful.
And they started passing beer around, and we did pretty well.
It was fun.
Fun.
So, anything else, Adam, you think we need to get? I don't want to give you time to get some B-roll.
I know you guys had a reunion in I guess it was 55 for the 10-year.
How'd you do? You read my book?
You read the book.
You did?
Yes, sir.
Yes, we did. We had one in 1965. It was the first one. And then another one in 1968, I think. Before we kind of lost contact. But the one in 65 was ironical. My company was doing, that was another story. My company was doing pretty well then. I'd gotten moved from my garage into an office and had a few people working for me. And we contracted with the parish of Plaquemine to light up 3 ball fields. And the last one that we had we completed the other 2, and we were building the one at Boothville. And we had our poles put up, we had all the lights on them, and everything connected, and we got word about the reunion, and so my oldest son and I flew up to South Carolina where the reunion was. And while we were there, we were hearing about Hurricane Betsy being in the Atlantic. And the people in South Carolina were preparing for the hurricane because they thought it was going to go into South Carolina. So after the reunion, we flew home, and by the time we got home, the hurricane was in the Gulf. It had reversed itself and crossed Florida and went into the Gulf and was headed straight for us. So I called the inspector to make sure that he had inspected the field and gave us a permit. Well, we found out he had come and looked at the field, but he hadn't given us the completion permit yet. And so we had quite a bit of money invested in that ball field. The storm completely wiped it out. The poles were knocked down, the lights were all knocked off. So we tried to collect, and the Perez's were running Plaquemine Parish then. And I went and had meetings with the president. It was President Perez, and they wouldn't pay us for it. They said, no, you didn't have a completion report, so you don't get paid. So time went on, and we didn't get paid. But just before, about in the middle part of '69, we decided we were going to build the field over again and get paid for it. So we did. The first time we lost about $150,000 on it that we had invested but didn't get paid. So we rebuilt the field again. Well, we started to rebuild it. We had the poles on the ground. These are big 100-foot creosote poles. We're digging the holes to put the poles in, and had all of the lighting fixtures and everything out laying on in the ball field, the football field. And we heard about Hurricane Camille coming in. So the long story was that, in the short story, Camille wiped it out again. And again, we didn't get paid. So we went along, and about in 1971, I think, I talked to the Perez's again. I said, we're going to build that ball field. This made the newspaper, by the way. The newspaper picked up on it and told their story, Times-Picayune. So we proceeded to build it again, and we did. We completed it. This time we got paid for it. About that time, the Corps of Engineers decided that they had to move the levee back and move it right in the middle of the ball field, so the ball field was never used.
You've got to be kidding.
And if you go down the river right now, you'll see a telephone pole, big 100-foot pole standing on the edge of the riverbank. It's out on the riverbank.
It's still there.
Yeah. Well, last time I went down the river, it was. It's been some years ago.
Is that crazy?
And so we built it 3 times and got paid once.
You should have charged them triple the price, is what I would have said. You could have charged triple.
Well, that was another story too, and I told about that in my book. We did a lot of work for the parish after Hurricane Betsy and didn't get paid for it.
Wow.
And so we quit working, doing commercial work altogether, and did nothing but industrial after that.
Yeah. You guys, you feel good?
Feel good?
Okay, good. So why don't we take? I'd love to get him out there by that
Oh yeah.
American flag.